Do you represent landlords and tenants, or is it just one or the other?
Yeah, so I represent both. Sometimes it's landlords dealing with income properties or tenants dealing with landlords that aren't providing a habitable place to live or that sort of stuff. But I tackle both sides, dealing with security deposits, nuisances, vermin. Right now I'm dealing with one where there's a bunch of mold and rats all over the place for landlords. I've dealt with scam artists, tenants, who are coming up with lies why they can't pay rent and just trying to buy time to find a new place to live. But yeah, I do both sides.
Interesting. So, how has the California law reacted to the fires that affect renting here in Los Angeles as a result?
Yeah, so Newsom, declared a state of emergency, but how that hits landlords and tenants is differently. Really, the protections he was looking for were related to protecting tenants in case they took in people that were affected by the fires and had no place to live. Essentially what they wrote was the landlords can't evict them for that reason. There's other protections that are coming out now in terms of price gouging and making sure that because there's, we lost all the houses in the Palisades and et cetera, that the landlords aren't jacking up prices, and so calling it an emergency. And then the way that it's played out, though, is not always the way that the government or people generally think that it will, creating kind of a landscape that nobody really knows what's going on or how it's going to play out. And so even now, after they've made the emergency protections, they've made changes to adapt with issues.
Did COVID protections mirror the protections for those displaced by the fires?
Yeah, actually, definitely. In as much as we dealt with it was a national problem, international problem. Here it was limited to LA County, but the government doing the flip of the script and flipping the wrist to make these protections that nobody really saw how it was going to play on the back end. The biggest issue with COVID that kind of was playing with the fires is who is the government asking to shoulder the burden, right? So tenants didn't do anything wrong. They got no place to live, so they shouldn't be evicted for taking in people that were affected by the fire. But landlords, they only have so many, their insurance only covers so many people. There's only so much space. More people means more utilities, more electricity, more water. And so if a landlord agreed to pay, to cover certain utilities, and then the tenant gets to move in a family of 5, even if they're in an emergency, who's going to cover the increase in those utilities? So it was similar to COVID in that, people couldn't work, so they didn't have money to pay, but money needed to be paid. It needed to be paid for the mortgages on properties. And so the people that I saw most affected negatively by those protections that on paper sound really good were the mom and pop people who own properties, because they still had mortgages to pay. That was their income. And so they didn't lose their job, but they lost the income source, which are supposed to be the tenants. And the government, they covered some of the rent payment, but really at the end of that, the COVID fiasco was not forgiveness, just forbearance. And even those tenants now, I've seen both sides of it, where the rent was not paid for those years, and now they're getting dragged into small claims court for hundreds of thousands of dollars of rent they still can't pay. So it was another one. It's kind of similar to now in that it's an emergency. People are trying to come up with, ways to deal with it, but the implications are not always what were intended.
What is the overall goal of these types of emergency legislation?
Yeah, they're trying to square peg round hole. There were things that we all knew could happen, but when they actually happen, we all got to step up and deal with it. They're just trying to deal with the things on the fly, and so people get caught up in it. So, for example, right now what's happening is the state is going after a bunch of realtors and property managers for jacking up their rents for over the 10%. Now, so there were some people that were getting wrapped up in it. Let's say you owned a house, you lived in your house, you weren't renting it, and then the fires happen and you have another place to live. You could live with mom and dad and you want to rent out your place. What was happening was there was this discrepancy of whether when I finally put my own home up for rent, am I still going to be bound by these 10% limitations? How would you tell a homeowner what their house is worth if they had been living in it, that are now renting it, that it's 10% or more? And so people started getting wrapped up in some litigation, civil penalties, financial penalties. You could be arrested for it. And so now they're walking it back. Newsom just did new exceptions for kind of the more upscale neighborhoods, Manhattan Beach, Marina Del Rey, RVV, that if it was essentially a 4-bedroom, super nice place that now they're putting up for rent, they're exempt from the rent caps, because clearly a 4+ bedroom in RPV or Manhattan Beach, if it wasn't listed and hadn't listed, it could be $5,000-$10,000. And now they're making these exceptions. They're walking it back because it was too broad during the emergency, and now you kind of got to fine tune it so that the wrong people don't get caught up in the legislation.
And are there unintended consequences? Like, how will this affect people's lives or their pocketbooks?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Again, what we learned, one of the things that happened with COVID, when the government came in and told landlords they weren't entitled to rent, it really forced landlords and homeowners after the pandemic to say, I can't, even if I got good tenants, I got to be increasing the rent every month, because if I don't, the government could come in and say, no, you can't anymore. Or, there were these tenant protections that were voted on repeatedly that kept being the people didn't want it. And then Newsom, flick of the wrist, signs into law the Tenant Protection Act 2019, and then that gave tenant protections to everybody about rent caps, about ways that you could be evicted, which are great for tenants, but how it affects them without them thinking is that now the landlords, their lawyers, the property managers, we gotta stay ahead of in case the government makes another grab, gives tenants a bunch of protections that don't take into account how it might affect the landlord's pocketbook. By and large, more rent increases, higher rents, which is not going to deal with the other issue, which is that there's not enough places to live. So really, the advice that I give to landlords is you got to make sure your rent is current. If you look the other way because they're good, they pay on time, they got a family, and that sort of stuff, and you aren't doing your annual increases within the confines of the law, you may not be able to again later down the road.
What other problems this legislation is causing tenants?
Yeah, so again, right now, the protections are they can't jack up rents too much during an emergency. There are protections if they bring in a displaced family that they can't get evicted. But at the end of the day, the protections will end. The fires are taken care of. I think even the protections are only in effect until March 6th, something like that. But then if you pissed off your landlord, if you did something like moved in a family of 5 or 10, and your landlord was responsible for the utilities, and you didn't pay them back, or they trashed the place, or an accident happened, the government's not going to be there when now you've got this relationship with your landlord that they may not have been happy with how you handled it. So the unintended consequences can be that even if you take advantage of those protections, the government's going to step back out of the way, and you're going to have a landlord to deal with who's got to take care of, making sure you got running water, making sure there's no mold or vermin and that sort of stuff. And you want to make sure we're not souring those relationships, because that can make life really hard.
Do you have any advice for landlords as a result of these emergency protections for tenants?
Advice? Talk to a lawyer. This stuff, it was similar to COVID. The rules kept changing. And I talked to homeowners and realtors and property managers. They're trying to make sure, what is the 10%? How are we coming up with the rent increases to make sure we're not in violation of the law? How do we know? What year? I haven't rented the place in 2 years. Is it fair market value from a year ago, 2 years ago? The advice is, you're at the whim of the government sometimes. And right now, during an emergency, it makes sense. But that's why it would also make sense to make sure, you're represented, that you're happy, you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's. Because if you get caught up and the government trying to make an example out of you, you raise it by 11% instead of 10%, still a technical violation, and you might end up on a newspaper, which no one will be happy with.
So what rights do tenants have that landlords often ignore?
That's a good question. Yeah, often the problem is like security deposits. So you got a tenant leaving, what things can or can't be taken out of the security deposit. There were new laws passed this year about that, making it a lot more specific of what a landlord's got to do. Coming in April, landlords have to do pre and post pictures and explanations of why certain things were taken out. You can't just do, invoices or just bills. You got to explain why. So usually, like before, a tenant would leave and they would wipe everything down, expecting normal wear and tear were fine. And they had it, let's say you moved in and there was a rug that was there the whole year. And that rug had been there for maybe the last 7 years, but you're there the year the landlord replaces it. You might get stuck with a bill for it. And then a tenant goes, well, what the hell? Why am I paying for this? The next person's going to get the benefit. Those are those kind of gray areas that often landlords will get into issues with. Separate from that, they generally don't want to do massive, remediation work if there's mold or there's vermin. They kind of want to do the bare minimum, because the more that they do, the more you acknowledge a problem. There's a question of whether they should be returned rent or money. And so you're kind of caught in this awkward area where you want to do the right thing, but we don't want to admit too much because it might be used against us. So usually it's kind of towing that line where the landlord will have property managers who want to do the right thing, but if they don't have the funds to do it, or they're concerned about the city getting involved, they may just do Band-Aids instead of proper overhauls to deal with the issues fundamentally.
I see. And what are some common real estate scams people should watch out for?
Scams. One that I've seen for property managers and owners is that they hire somebody to do background checks, and you may assume certain things are done without checking. So I had these owners who had a property manager who was a buddy of theirs, and they had a Section 8 tenant, and the property manager wrongfully assumed because you're Section 8, the government might have cleared you for being a felon or a bad guy or something. And that's not what happened. They just cleared whether they were qualifying for Section 8. So they actually moved in a gang member into a property that was immediately turned into a drug house. People were attacked there. Police were getting involved. And so what I had to deal with is, hey, we can go out to the tenant for creating a nuisance, but also the property manager for not doing background checks. So a scam could be, fake IDs, fake social security number to get into a property. I had another one recently too. They turned it into a drug den. The two people that said they lived there never existed. So that was on the landlord side. For tenants, it's just to make sure that whatever your landlord or whatever your property management is saying that they're doing, we want to make sure that you have proof. You don't just want to take their conclusions. If they're doing inspections, we want to see the results. We want to make sure that they're not telling you only half the story. I had clients who they found lead in the property, and so they moved everybody out, did the lead testing, fixed the place up, and then said, okay, you're good to go and to move back. But we hadn't gotten the results back that it was actually cleared. The tenants moved back in and there were still traces of lead. They had to move out again. And so you just want to make sure that if you're the tenant, the scam is really just to make sure we're not taking people at their word, but that you've got a paper trail to back it up, so that if they're lying to you, you have something to go back to the city with.
Do landlords have too much power over tenants?
Yeah, so it depends on what we're trying to protect the tenants from. I would say generally no, that there's a lot of checks and balances that the city, the state, the government provides to make sure that if landlords and property managers are getting out of whack, that you have recourse, right? There's defenses to evictions if you're not paying them rent, but it's because they're harassing you or it's because you did repair and deduct. They won't fix the AC, they won't fix the basic human rights, and you had to do it yourself. You have those types of protections. I think the problem is that tenants, it's about their lives and survival. Landlords and property managers, it's about money. So I think that discrepancy is usually what leads to miscommunication, or both sides, the way that they pit against each other. One is saying, hey, tenant, you're not listening, you're messing with my bottom line. The tenant goes, hey man, I live here, this is my life, this is my family, like what do you want from me? Often for me, what I'm counseling clients, whether they're tenants or landlords, is to kind of remind us that we're not on the same side, we're not the same people, but we got to just take a step back into what we think is fair, because if you don't, Uncle Sam's gonna probably step in and make sure that somebody's gonna see the wrong side of the law.
Should squatters have rights?
Should they have them? They do. I don't think landlords or tenants, I don't think anybody really likes squatters. Squatters maybe like themselves. Because essentially a squatter is somebody who's living in a property who's not supposed to be there. And so sometimes, your lease ends, you don't get out on time, you become a squatter. Or I've had clients where people, they know the house is abandoned, they break in, they fabricate nailings to make it seem like they're a tenant at the property, so that when the sheriffs show up to take them out, they say, hey, I live here.
It's a good exercise.
You're not able to get rid of me. I'm a tenant here. And so I think there's kind of a misnomer of, you don't think of a squatter as somebody who says, hey, Mr. Officer, I'm a squatter, I'm out of here. It's usually a random person who will try to convince someone that they have certain rights. And so the issue is where criminality meets civil. Right, so the police show up and you say, this guy's a squatter, he broke into my house. If he's got mailings that say the place, or he's got a fabricated lease, I've seen people make fake leases to hand to law enforcement and say, no, I live here. My tenant or my landlord owner, he goes, how could this person live here? I'm renting to this guy. But they'll have these documents that then the police look at it and they go, well, this isn't really a criminal matter of a squatter breaking in. This is a fight between a landlord and a tenant, and the police don't want anything to do with it. And they say, you got to go through the eviction process. So the squatter's rights, usually it's not that they're allowed to be there. It's that if they can convince someone who's supposed to deal with them, the police, that they're supposed to be there, the police may say, look, our hands are tied. He's got paperwork that says he's supposed to be here. I can't just run him out of here. You got to go through a process, give a notice, go through the eviction process, schedule the lockout, and then I can get rid of them. So again, should they have rights? Why are they a squatter? I mean, if they're there because, they don't have money and there's those types of issues, that's what the legal process is there for. But if it's literally just someone who won't leave or somebody who breaks in and acts like they're a tenant, I mean, those people shouldn't be afforded rights. They got to be dealt with.
What's your opinion on laws that limit Airbnb and short-term rentals?
Yeah, I mean, they're necessary evil. Most people say, hey, it's my house, I should be able to do what I want to do. If I'm paying the mortgage, make a little extra income, what's the big deal? But I've had cases where it is a big deal. It was an income property not far from here, from downtown Los Angeles. And this developer bought the lot next door, turned it into a rental. But what he wrote with his tenant was it was supposed to be commercial. But the guy who bought up all the leases turned it into residential. And so he made them a bunch of like Airbnbs, short-term, couple, night rentals. And it was just a party haven. Like these people, I saw a bunch of videos of people puking into the lawns, trash everywhere, just going until 3, 4 in the morning. And so my clients were kind of the next house over, a family, and they can't sleep now anymore. And so tenants are pissed at the income owner, who's pissed at the neighbor. So I get involved and we got to threaten litigation. And the idea was, it's not just that they're making money. It's great, right? With America, we can make money. But like if you're interfering with other people's ability to live or sleep or other people's money, that's the problem. And so we lawyered up. They said we didn't do anything wrong. We can have our own tenants. This is America and that sort of stuff. But when I got a copy of the lease, that's when it was clear that they had rented it to somebody who said they would not use it in this way. And so once I got that into the lawyer's hands for the neighbor, we all kind of looked at it and said, okay, the bad guy is the person who's doing the Airbnbs. The owner knows he's not supposed to be doing it. And so when we're suing, we're looking at lowering the value of the property, lost rent. My clients had to pay relocation fees and deduct rent. There are a few different tenants because they kept leaving it because it's too much partying. Attorney's fees and that sort of stuff, tens of thousands of dollars that these guys had to pay, which they then leveraged to get to cancel the lease so they didn't have to rent it anymore to this bad guy. So that's a situation where, yes, people should be entitled to use their houses for how they want, but frankly, it's going to impact other things too. Like in the beach cities, it's about parking. It's about utilities. We got a bunch of people coming in and out. Generally, has the potential to be increasing crime. You've got people that are coming in, don't give a shit about the neighborhood. They don't care how it's going to be treated. You want, the residents to have ownership of where they're staying. So there'll be these things that, when you think Airbnb, we think of vacation, we think of, traveling, but you don't really think about the destination. The destination's going to have to foot the burden of these randoms that are coming in. Hopefully they're respectable. Hopefully they do that sort of stuff. But if it's all just about money, things get lost in the chaos.